The queen of the Veth ascendancy had not been afraid in 41 years of rule. She was afraid now. The sovereign chamber was emptying. Her personal guard, 16 warriors of the Velketh order, each one selected through a decade of trial and discipline, each one sworn to die before they allowed harm to reach her, were moving toward the exits. Not fleeing, not running. Moving with the careful, controlled speed of people executing a protocol, which was almost worse, because it meant the situation had become the kind of situation that had a protocol, which meant the protocol had been written by someone who had imagined exactly this, which meant this was a thing that happened. The breach alarm had sounded 40 seconds ago. 3 Kethavar strike teams, simultaneous entry through maintenance corridors on 3 levels. Armed with disruption weapons and something new, a signal scrambler that had knocked out the palace's internal communications network in the first 30 seconds. No reinforcements were coming. No one outside the chamber knew what was happening inside it. The Velketh Guard's training called for immediate withdrawal of the protected dignitary to the secondary safe location. The problem was that the secondary safe location was on the other side of the corridor, where the first strike team had entered. The queen stood in the center of the sovereign chamber, and she was afraid, and she was alone, except for one person who had not moved. He was standing between her and the main doors. He was a human. He was her infrastructure contractor. He was here because she had asked him to personally review the environmental system specifications for the chamber renovation, and he had arrived that morning with a tablet and a tool bag, and now he was standing in front of the main door with his tool bag at his feet and his arms at his sides, and the particular quality of stillness that she had learned in her 41 years of ruling to distinguish from paralysis. He was not paralyzed. "You should go," she said. "There is a service exit behind the eastern screen. It connects to the lower levels. You could reach it before." "I know where it is," he said. "I installed the pressure couplings on that corridor." "Then you should use it." He looked at her over his shoulder. He had very calm eyes. Brown, she had always thought, was a color that suggested earth and groundedness, and she had never understood until this moment that she had been observing something accurate. "Your radiance," he said, in the careful formal address he always used with a faint undertone of self-consciousness, as if formality was a coat that didn't quite fit him but that he wore out of respect. "With the greatest possible esteem for your concern, I'm not going anywhere." Oh, she did not understand this yet. She would. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning specialist for 26 years. He said this about himself without irony and without false modesty, in the way that people describe the thing they actually are rather than the thing they wish they were. HVAC, the hidden systems, the ones inside the walls, behind the ceilings, under the floors, the ones that made the difference between a building that was livable and a building that was a large, expensive box of uncomfortable air. He had apprenticed at 19 under a man named Carl Ostrander in Raleigh, North Carolina, who had the firm belief that the only way to understand a system was to be inside it, and who had made Marcus crawl through more ductwork in 3 years of apprenticeship than most people see in a lifetime. Carl had also taught him that the most important question in any job was not what was broken, but what had been ignoring that something was broken. Systems didn't fail suddenly, Carl said. They failed gradually, and the failure was always preceded by a period when someone noticed something wasn't right and decided it wasn't their problem yet. Marcus had taken this lesson well beyond its original application. He was 51 years old. He had a son, Darius, 24, who worked in renewable energy installation and called him every Thursday with a reliability that Marcus found deeply reassuring and occasionally worked hard not to say so. He had a sister in Charlotte who sent him articles about things she thought he should know about, which was her particular form of love. He had a house in Raleigh with a garage that was better organized than any other room in the house. because the garage was where he kept his tools, and tools were things he understood completely. He had never expected, at 26, to end up doing what he ended up doing. The contract with the Collective Outreach Infrastructure Program had come through a recommendation from a colleague who had done a posting on one of the outer stations and described it as the strangest thing I've ever done and also the best-paying job of my life. And Marcus, you'd be good at it? Marcus had been skeptical. He was not a skeptic by nature. He was, if anything, constitutionally inclined toward taking things at face value and seeing what they actually were rather than what he expected them to be. But the idea of leaving Earth for an extended period when Darius was 19 and still figuring things out had felt like bad timing. Darius had told him to go. Dad, he'd said, with the straightforward practicality that Marcus recognized as his own characteristic having been successfully transmitted, I'm an adult. I'll call you every Thursday. Go do the weird job. He'd gone. The weird job had become, over 8 years, a career he could not have designed if he'd tried. He'd worked on 4 stations, 2 orbital installations, and a ground-based complex on a planet with an atmospheric composition that required him to learn more about pressure differential engineering than he'd thought possible. He'd become, through accumulated experience rather than intention, one of the human specialists most frequently requested for work in VETH administrative facilities, because the VETH discovered that his particular combination of practical expertise and methodical observation tended to find the things that more specialized consultants missed. He'd been working in the VETH Ascendancy's palace complex for 6 months when the Queen had personally requested that he review the Sovereign Chamber renovation specifications. It was an unusual request. Contractors at his level didn't typically interact directly with the Ascendancy, but the palace's senior engineer had explained that the Queen had reviewed the previous environmental assessment and had identified 3 specific concerns that she wanted a human perspective on. This was, Marcus had understood without being told, because the Queen had learned something that the VETH administrative system was slowly and somewhat reluctantly incorporating into its practice. That the particular combination of generalist knowledge and cross-system thinking that certain human specialists brought to infrastructure work could catch things that specialists trained within a single framework sometimes missed. He had found this flattering and had tried not to show it, because showing flattery struck him as the kind of thing that led to overconfidence, and overconfidence led to the kind of errors that made systems fail gradually. He had met the Queen 3 times in 6 months of working in her palace. Each meeting had been brief, formal, and unexpectedly substantive. She asked real questions. She understood the answers. She followed up on things he'd said in previous meetings in ways that indicated she had actually thought about them rather than simply received them. He had, despite himself, come to find her genuinely impressive, in the specific way that Marcus found people impressive when they were clearly very good at something hard. He had been in the Sovereign Chamber for 40 minutes, reviewing the ductwork specifications on his tablet and making notes about a pressure differential he didn't like, when the alarm sounded. The Sovereign Chamber was large and formal and not, Marcus had always privately thought, particularly well designed for the purpose of protecting anyone. The architecture was oriented around display. The high ceilings, the elaborate entry corridor, the placement of the throne at the far end of a long open floor, which was appropriate for a room whose function was to project authority and which was deeply unhelpful in a crisis, because it meant there was a great deal of open space with very few structural features that could serve as cover. He had done a mental inventory of the room automatically the first time he'd been admitted to it, because doing a mental inventory of a space was as natural to him as breathing. He knew where the load-bearing elements were, where the ductwork ran inside the walls, where the service access panels were located. He knew the Eastern Service exit because he had personally supervised the work on that corridor. He knew that the main door was rated for significant structural stress, because the palace engineer had specified premium materials throughout the renovation. He knew, looking at the door, that the Kethavar strike team would have specialized breaching equipment, because that was what strike teams used, and premium door specifications bought time rather than prevention. He knew he had approximately 2 to 4 minutes before that door was opened. The Queen had told him to use the service exit. He had looked at the service exit, specifically at the route between the main door and the service exit, and at where the Queen was standing and at the geometry of the situation. "Your Radiance," he said, "can you reach the service exit without crossing the main entry corridor?" She assessed the room quickly. "No." "Then neither of us can," he said. "If they're coming through the main door, anyone moving toward the eastern side of the room crosses their line of entry. They'd be in a better position than we are in the time it takes to cross that floor." She absorbed this, the western access. "Behind the throne dais, I know, but the western access connects to the honor guard barracks, and that's where the secondary strike team entered if they're running a standard three-point breach. They'd have that corridor controlled by now." He looked at the door. "We have this room." You intend to hold this room?" "I intend to not give up the position we have until I understand what our options are." He picked up his tool bag. "That's different from holding it. Holding it implies I have something to hold it with." He said this without drama, in the tone of someone making a technical assessment rather than a declaration. The Queen, who had spent 41 years surrounded by people making declarations, found this more alarming than a declaration would have been, because it meant he was thinking rather than performing, and thinking was what you did when you were actually trying to solve something. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Buying times," he said, "and looking for what I have that they probably don't know about." He crossed to the nearest wall panel. The Sovereign Chamber's renovation had included a complete overhaul of the environmental systems, and Marcus had specified the work personally, which meant he knew that behind this particular panel was not only the main duct junction for the chamber's atmospheric circulation, but also the emergency pressure control for the whole eastern section of the palace level. He opened the panel. "There's a fire suppression override in here," he said. "It's tied to the atmospheric system throughout this section. If I trigger it, it floods the corridors outside with suppression agent. It's not harmful, it's designed for occupied spaces, but it significantly reduces visibility and makes movement in confined corridors substantially harder." The Queen was very still. "That system is not documented in the security protocols." "No, it was added in the renovation as a safety redundancy for the environmental systems. I added it." He looked at her. "I have the access codes." "A pause, then do it." "Well, not yet," he said. She looked at him. "If I do it now, they know we triggered it, and they slow down and wait for it to clear, or they put on atmospheric equipment, and either way we've used our one active tool for maybe 10 minutes of delay." He closed the panel. "I want to know their timeline before I spend it." He went to his tablet and pulled up the environmental monitoring system, which was still running on the local building network even though communications were down. The atmospheric sensors throughout the palace gave him real-time readings for every section. He could read the air movement patterns. 3 minutes of looking at the sensor data. The Queen stood 2 meters away and watched him and did not speak, because she had identified this as the kind of work that required the person doing it to be fully inside it. "The western corridor, the one from the honor guard barracks, they're not moving." He pointed at the readings on the tablet. "The atmospheric disturbance from movement shows up in the sensor data. The eastern corridor has movement, that's the main strike team. They're being methodical, they're not rushing." He looked at the door. "They think they have time, they're clearing rooms systematically on the way up. They don't know we're not in the secondary safe location." "How long?" "Maybe 18 minutes, maybe 20. Our communications." "Still down, the scrambler is in the western section somewhere." He looked at the sensor data again. "Actually, He zoomed in on the atmospheric readings for the Western Service Junction. The scrambler generates heat. These sensor readings have a thermal signature that's inconsistent with normal system operation. He traced the pattern with his finger. It's in junction 7W. That's a maintenance space on this level, if someone could reach it. The service connections on this level. The interior service corridors are small, he said. Humans small, he looked at her. The Velketh guards. They took the emergency evacuation route, standard protocol. There was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness. They will be seeking to mount a counterentry from the lower levels. They are not, at this moment, in a position to reach the Western Junction. Marcus thought about this. Thought about the interior service corridors which he had specified and which he knew with the precision of someone who had argued with the palace engineer for 3 hours about their dimensions, until the engineer had agreed to make them large enough to actually service without removing the walls. Thought about the tool bag in his hand. "Your radiance," he said. "Have you ever had to be somewhere that was smaller than you wanted it to be and stay calm about I?" "I'll tell you." She looked at him. "I beg your pardons." The interior service corridors. I could reach junction 7W in about 12 minutes if nothing goes wrong. I have the tools to disable or destroy the scrambler, but they're being watched. He indicated the atmospheric sensor data, and the moment I open a service access panel, someone monitoring the corridor is going to know something moved. You are proposing to go through the interior service corridor. I'm saying I could, theoretically. He met her eyes. But I'd be leaving you alone in this room. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. 41 years of rule. 41 years of being the person that other people protected, that other people positioned themselves around, that other people moved in orbit of. She had not, in 41 years, been asked what she was willing to risk for herself as a practical question by someone who was already calculating the angles. "What would I need to do," she said carefully, "while you were in the corridors? Stay in this room, stay away from the main door. If they breach before I get back," he was already pulling out the panel again, checking the suppression system controls, confirming the access codes, trigger the suppression system. "That gives you more time, not unlimited time, but more." He paused. "And there's one more thing." He opened his tool bag and produced something she did not immediately recognize. It was a length of heavy-gauge wire, wound into a tight coil. "This is load-bearing wire," he said. "From the renovation supplies I had in my kit. If you thread it through the main door mechanism here and here," he showed her briefly, precisely, "and anchor it to the floor attachment point on the throne dais, it significantly complicates how fast that door opens even with breaching equipment. It's not going to stop them, but every minute matters." She looked at the wires, looked at him, looked at the doors. "You are asking your queen," she said slowly, "to wire a door." "I'm asking if you're capable of it," he said. "Those are different questions." She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she held out her hand. He put the wire in it. 12 minutes, he said. Maybe 15. Don't open the service panel until I'm through and you've secured it from this side. I'll show you the latch. Well, he showed her the latch. Then he picked up his tool bag, opened the service panel, and crawled into the wall. The interior service corridor was not designed for comfort. It was designed to be functional, which Marcus had insisted meant large enough to actually work in, but large enough to work in and comfortable were different things. And what he had specified was a crawl space approximately 90 centimeters high and 70 wide that ran through the interior of the palace level in a route that connected the major system junctions. He had been in smaller spaces. He had done a job on a Veth orbital station 3 years ago that had required him to work in a section of ductwork 60 centimeters across for 4 hours while replacing a coolant regulator, and that experience had been his personal benchmark for confined space work ever since, against which everything else was measured. This was better than that. He held that thought and breathed slowly and moved. He had turned off his tablet light. It was battery-powered and wouldn't affect the atmospheric sensors, but light leaking through service panel seams was a thing that careful people noticed. He navigated by memory and by touch, which was something he had learned to do in his first years of apprenticeship, because Carl had believed that knowing a system well enough to work in it in the dark was the only real test of whether you knew a system. He counted the junction connections as he passed them. First junction, second junction, left turn at the main duct crossing. The sounds from outside the walls reached him with the muffled, directionless quality of sounds in enclosed spaces, footsteps somewhere, voices he couldn't make out, once something that might have been a controlled breach charge and might have been a door being forced. He moved toward the western section. He thought about Darius. Not because he was afraid, but he had found that the fear was more manageable if he put it in a defined compartment and continued working, which was the approach he took to all problems he couldn't resolve with available information. He thought about Darius because he'd been thinking about him since this morning, when he'd found a voicemail from Thursday that he hadn't listened to yet, and there was something uncomfortable about having an unlistened-to message from his son in his pocket while he crawled through the wall of a palace under attack. He made a note to listen to it the moment he had a moment. Junction 7W was marked in the system schematic as a utility consolidation point, the location where 4 different systems ran in close proximity and Ray for efficiency, certain shared controls were located. It was slightly larger than the corridor, a small node space about 1 meter by 1.5, designed to give a technician room to work. He reached it and oriented himself. The thermal signature on the sensor data had indicated the scrambler was in this space or immediately adjacent to it. He produced a small diagnostic tool from his kit, standard equipment, essentially a handheld sensor that read electrical output and slowly swept the junction. The scrambler was in the ventilation duct on the north face. Someone had placed it in the duct access, which was, he noted this with a particular quality of professional disapproval, a modification that had not been authorized and that was going to do significant damage to the duct lining from the heat output over any extended period. He also noted that it was not being monitored from inside the junction. Whoever had placed it and moved on. He opened the duct access and looked at the device. It was not a type he recognized. Kethavar equipment, presumably designed by people who expected it to be operated by Kethavar specialists. He could see the power cell housing and the emission array and the control interface, and the control interface was, to his professional eye, largely incomprehensible. He spent 45 seconds looking at it. Then he looked at the power cell housing. Power cells had connection points. Connection points could be disconnected. This was true across a remarkably wide range of technologies because the fundamental physics of electrical power connection was not something that varied as dramatically as the systems built around it. He disconnected the power cell. The scrambler went off. Not explosively, it simply stopped, the way things stopped when you disconnected them from their power source, with a faint residual emission and then nothing. He cut his comm units, waited. Static, then S-Sivith's voice. S-Sivith was here because of course S-Sivith was here, the IDI's administrative coordinator for the palace systems, saying his name with a quality of relief that Marcus would remember for a long time. Communications are back, Marcus said. Where's the Velketh response team? Second level west, they have the main strike team contained. The Eastern team is 12 minutes from the Sovereign Chamber if they haven't changed pace. He checked his kit. I need to go back. A maintenance technician, Webb. Not a maintenance technician, he said automatically. HVAC specialist. He picked up his bag and started moving. But same answer, whatever I am, I have to go back. He reached the service panel of the Sovereign Chamber in 9 minutes, which was faster than he'd said. because he did not stop moving and because the second time through a route is always faster than the first. He tapped the panel in the sequence he'd shown the queen 3, pause 2, and heard the latch release from the other side. He came out of the wall and found the queen standing 4 meters from the main door, which was threaded with heavy-gauge load-bearing wire anchored to the throne dais, and which had clearly been attempted by something on the outside, because the wire was under significant tension and the door frame showed stress marks. The queen was holding her end of the wire, which was wrapped twice around her forearm. "They tried the door about 6 minutes ago," she said. Her voice was steady. "The wire held. They went to a different approach after that, and I haven't heard movement in the corridor for approximately 4 minutes. Velketh has the main strike team on the second level. Communications are back up. They'll have coordination now." He looked at the door, at the wire, at her. "Are you all right?" She looked at the wire wrapped around her forearm, at the tension in it. She had stood here, alone, holding this wire, and she had not let go. "I find that I am," she said. She sounded slightly surprised. He crossed to the suppression system panel and checked the status, still primed, not triggered good. He pulled up his tablet and looked at the atmospheric sensor data. The eastern corridor movement pattern was gone, which meant the eastern strike team had been neutralized or had withdrawn. "It's over," he said, "or close enough. Velketh will clear the remaining corridors and will have formal all clear inside 20 minutes. He sat down on the renovation materials he'd stacked that morning, which were still sitting where he'd placed them 7 hours ago and which felt like artifacts from a different reality. "You can let go of the wire." She looked at her arm, unwound the wire carefully with the methodical care of someone finishing a task to completion rather than simply dropping it, set it on the floor. Oh, she looked at him. He was sitting on a stack of structural panels eating half a nutrition bar that he had produced from his tool bag with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who ate when they had a moment because moments were unpredictable, and who found this no more or less dignified than anything else that had happened in the last hour. "You went into the wall," she said. "Oh, yes. Then came back. That was the plan." She was quiet for a moment. "My guard calculated that their protocol, immediate withdrawal to the secondary safe location, was the optimal response. They were trained for this. They were following their training." "As I know, you were not trained for this." "No," he agreed. "You had no protocol, no instruction." "No," she paused, searching for the right word in a language that was her fourth and his first designated function for this situation. "That's right." "Then why?" She sat down in the nearest chair, which was a renovation work chair rather than anything ceremonial, and this seemed not to concern her at all. "Not why did you stay, I understand something of that. But why did you go into the wall? That was not remaining. That was choosing to act when you could have remained still. When remaining still was, arguably, the safer choice for you personally." He finished the nutrition bar and considered the question. "Safest thing for me personally was the service exit," he said, "but that wasn't available to both of us. So the safest thing for both of us was for me to go and fix the thing that was making everything worse." He paused. "The scrambler being on is the root problem. Every other problem, no communication, no coordination, no response, comes from the scrambler. If you treat a symptom and leave the root cause, the symptoms keep coming." He looked at his hands. "That's how systems work. That's how problems work. You find the thing that's making everything else fail and you address that first." "And you were not afraid to go into the wall." He looked at her. "I was afraid the whole time. I was counting junctions to keep from thinking about it directly and thinking about my son and doing the job because the job was what I could actually influence." She absorbed this. The Velketh order is selected for the absence of fear under threat. It is considered the fundamental qualification. "I think," he paused, choosing carefully. "The absence of fear and the management of fear might look the same from the outside." "And from the inside." From the inside, they're very different, he said. One of them is something you are, the other is something you do. The all-clear signal came through on his comm unit. He acknowledged it, set the tablet down, looked at the rooms, the wire on the floor, the stress door frame, the stack of structural panels, the open wall panel where he'd come and gone. I have to file an incident report, he said. For the suppression system override I almost triggered. Even if I didn't trigger it, I primed it for immediate activation, and that has to be documented. She looked at him. Something in her expression had the quality of someone who has been expecting something and received something else instead, and has not yet decided what to do with the difference. You have been in an active security crisis for the last 53 minutes, she said. The first thing you think of afterward is the paperwork. The paperwork is how the next person who's in this situation benefits from what I learned, he said simply. If I don't document the suppression override protocol, the next HVAC specialist who ends up in an emergency doesn't know it's an option. He paused. Besides, the palace engineer is going to ask me about it anyway, and I'd rather have the report already filed. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, there is a word in the Old Veth formal language. It is not used much anymore because it describes a quality that the modern system has difficulty categorizing. The word is Velshanthar. It means approximately the one who is useful in the wrong situation. It originated as a description of individuals who appeared in historical accounts doing the right thing at the wrong time or the unexpected thing in the place where the expected thing had failed. She paused. It was not always used as a compliment. It implies a kind of disorder, a person who does not fit the available categories of role and function. That's probably fair, Marcus said. I am reconsidering whether it is not, in fact, the highest possible form of compliment, she said. The formal review of the Sovereign Chamber incident took 6 weeks and produced a report that Marcus read carefully and found, on balance, accurate. It addressed the security failures that had allowed the breach, the communication vulnerabilities that had been exploited, and the protocol gaps that had prevented the Velketh Guard from executing their secondary response effectively. It also contained a section on what it termed unclassified personnel contributions to incident response, which was the bureaucratic language for what Marcus had done, and which described his actions in the careful, measured prose of people who are trying to say something that doesn't fit their available vocabulary. He read it, filed his copies, sent the incident report about the suppression system to the palace engineer, who had 7 questions that Marcus answered in detail. He was back on the Sovereign Chamber renovation the following week, because the renovation was still ongoing and the work didn't stop because of an incident, and because the Queen had specifically requested the continuation of work on the original timeline, which had been her way, efficient, direct, practical, of indicating that the incident was concluded and life was proceeding. He was reviewing the pressure differential on the eastern duct junction, which had been bothering him since before everything happened and which had continued to bother him when the Queen came in. She came alone, which was unusual. Her schedule was structured in ways that made unaccompanied movement uncommon. She was carrying a document in the Veth style, a formal text on treated material, and she set it on the work surface beside his tablet. Oh, he looked at it. The formal citation, he said, for the incident report. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. There is a tradition for citations of this nature that the recipient is asked what they would find most meaningful as acknowledgement. It is not always followed, but it is the tradition. Marcus thought about this. Better access to the Western service junctions, he said. The route I took to reach the scrambler has 2 bottlenecks that shouldn't be there. I specified wider dimensions in the original renovation plans and they got narrowed in the cost review. That made last week harder than it needed to be. She looked at him. You want the service corridors widened. And better sensor integration for the interior junctions. If I could have accessed the real-time atmospheric data from inside the service network, I could have moved faster. He picked up his tablet. I can write it up as a technical specification, probably 2 pages. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he looked up from the tablet. Marcus, she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal title appended. He waited. My guard has been with me for 11 years, she said. Many of them for longer. They are brave, trained, committed. They went where their protocol told them to go. I do not, she paused. I do not blame them for this. The protocol was written by people who were trying to protect me, and the protocol failed because the situation was not the situation the protocol anticipated. She was quiet for a moment. But they left, and you stayed, and then you went into the wall. And I have been thinking for 6 weeks about why those two things are so different in how they feel. Marcus set down the tablet. My guard would give their lives for me, she said. I have never doubted this. They have sworn it. It is for the Velketh the central fact of their existence. They exist in service to this function. And I think, she paused carefully, I think that when the protocol told them to withdraw, they followed the protocol in part because the protocol was the structure within which their sacrifice was meaningful. Outside the protocol, their sacrifice would be unstructured, unofficial. Not the sacrifice they had prepared to make. They needed it to count in the right way, Marcus said quietly. Yes, she met his eyes. And you had no protocol, no function, no designated way for your sacrifice to count, and you stayed anyway. Well, he was quiet. Why, she said, not the practical reasoning you gave me in the room, the other reason. He thought about Karl Ostrander, who had taught him that the only way to understand a system was to be inside it. He thought about Darius's voicemail, which he had listened to that night, and which had been Darius telling him about a job that had gone well and a girl he'd met and asking when Marcus was coming home next. He thought about the root problem and the symptoms, and about how the most important thing in any system failure was identifying the source rather than treating the effects. You were alone in the room, he said, and I could do something about that. He paused. I've never been able to be in a situation where something is broken and I can do something about it and just leave. I've tried to figure out if that's a virtue or a compulsion, and I'm honestly not sure, but it's what I am. She was quiet for a long time. The Velketh have a phrase, she said finally. It translates as we stand so others do not have to. It is the central statement of their purpose, the reason their sacrifice is meaningful, the structure within which they exist. She paused. I have been looking for 6 weeks for the equivalent phrase for what you did, for the structure that explains it. She looked at him directly. I don't think they're I. S1, I think the absence of a structure is the point. You were not standing so others did not have to. You were standing because you were in the room and someone needed someone to stand and you were able. That's it, he said. That's exactly it. She nodded slowly, looked at the citation document on the work surface. The service corridors, she said, and the sensor integration. 2 pages, he said, maybe 3. Write it up, she said, and then write up whatever else you think should have been different, not just in this room. Whatever you've noticed in 6 months of working in this palace that hasn't been right and that no one has asked you to say. She paused. You have been noticing things. I have watched you notice things. You document what you see. Always, he said. Then document it, all of it. I will read it. She picked up the citation document and held it for a moment, not handing it to him, just holding it. And Marcus, the next time you find something that concerns you in this palace's systems, do not wait to be asked. He looked at her. Understood, he said. She set the citation on the work surface beside his tool bag and left. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his tablet, opened a new document, and started writing. The specifications document he submitted 3 weeks later was 47 pages long. It covered the service corridor dimensions and sensor integration, as he'd said. It also covered 6 specific vulnerabilities in the palace's atmospheric system that would allow a knowledgeable actor to use the ventilation network to distribute something other than atmospheric gas. It covered two structural inefficiencies in the load-bearing elements of the main corridor that created predictable failure points under directed stress. It covered the Maintenance Access Protocol, which had not been updated since the last renovation, and which contained authorization pathways that no longer matched the actual system architecture. And it covered, in a section near the end that he'd almost taken out and then decided to leave in, a set of observations about the palace's overall design philosophy, the way that form and function had in several critical areas been prioritized in the wrong order. The palace was designed to project authority. It was not, in several specific ways that he documented with careful detail, designed to function well under stress. The palace engineer read the document and had 43 questions. Marcus answered them all. The queen read the document and had one comment, delivered through her chief of staff in a note that arrived 3 days later. The note said, "This is the document I should have had 6 months ago. Please ensure that all future observations of this nature are submitted as they occur rather than accumulated." He filed the note in his project documentation. Thought about Carl Ostrander, who had said that you didn't wait until you had a full picture to report that something wasn't right. You reported the thing that wasn't right when you noticed it, and you built the picture as you went. He thought about the things he'd noticed and not reported because they weren't his designated area and he hadn't wanted to overreach. He wrote up 3 more documents. Darius called on Thursday, as he always did. Marcus was in the service corridor, a different one, on a different level, doing the work that had accumulated during the 6 weeks of review and follow-up. He took the call sitting in the corridor with his back against the wall and his tool bag beside him, because the corridor was wide enough to sit in comfortably now, following the specification changes. Darius asked how things were going. Marcus told him about the documents, in general terms without the classified details that weren't his to share. Told him about the specifications and the changes being implemented and the follow-up work. "So you basically rewrote the palace security manual," Darius said. "The infrastructure portions," Marcus said. "The actual security protocols are someone else's area. But you pointed out the problems. I documented what I saw." There was a brief pause. "Dad, you were in a palace under attack and you spent the whole time fixing things." "There were things to fix. Most people would have just—" "I know," he leaned back against the wall. "I'm not most people in that specific way, I think you know that." "I do know that." Darius's voice had shifted slightly, not worried, something warmer than worried. I want to make sure you know that that's not nothing, what you are." Marcus thought about the queen holding the wire, about the junction in the wall where he disconnected a power cell and a scrambler had become a paperweight, about the tool bag at his side that had, on a specific afternoon, contained the difference between a bad situation and a catastrophic one. "I know," he said. "Carl used to say your tools and your judgment are what why. Though everything else is what happens to you." Carl sounds like he was a smart guy. "He was a great HVAC technician," Marcus said, "which is not a small thing." He finished the call and sat in the corridor for a moment, in the wider space that existed now because he had argued with an engineer 3 hours until they agreed to make it wider. In the service network of a palace that was incrementally becoming a building that worked rather than a building that looked like it worked. He thought about the queen saying, "Document it, all of it, don't wait to be asked." He opened a new document on his tablet. He started writing. The Velketh order underwent a formal review as a result of the incident. This was expected. The review was thorough and, by the accounts Marcus heard secondhand, occasionally difficult. The questions about protocol and individual judgment in situations the protocol didn't anticipate were not comfortable questions for an organization whose identity was built on the value of protocol. The review produced a supplemental document, Marcus read it when it was shared with relevant facility personnel. It was careful and measured and covered a great deal of ground, and near the end, in a section on what it called collaborative protective function, it used a phrase that he read twice and then read again. The phrase was, "The protection of the protected is not solely a function of those designated to protect." He's thought about that for a while. He filed the document in his project archives. 2 months after the incident, the lead Velketh commander, a senior officer named Velshareth who had been on duty the day of the breach, and who had, Marcus understood, spent 2 months with something very like a Vel-Kuron, a framework uncertainty, came to find him in the palace infrastructure wing. They talked for about an hour, not about the incident specifically, about systems. About the relationship between the systems you built and the failures you were prepared for and the failures you weren't. About the difference between a protocol that covered the expected situation and a judgment that covered the actual one. Velsharath asked him, at some point, what it had felt like to be the only person in the room. Marcus thought about it. "I wasn't thinking about being the only person," he said. "I was thinking about the problem. That helps. If you're thinking about the fact that you're the only one, you start thinking about all the reasons someone else should be there instead of you, and then you're in your own head instead of in the problem. How do you remain in the problems?" "Practice," Marcus said, "and a very good mentor who made me crawl through a lot of ductwork until it stopped being frightening and started being familiar." Velshareth was quiet for a moment. "We train extensively in combat and threat response. We do not train in infrastructure." "No," Marcus agreed. "Well, perhaps we should." "I can tell you where the service corridors are," Marcus said, "and what the atmospheric sensors can and can't tell you, and how the suppression system works because that's documented now." He paused. "The more people who know what's inside the walls, the fewer situations where the only person who knows is an HVAC specialist eating half a nutrition bar." Velsharath looked at him for a moment. "Is that what you were doing when the Queen found you in the Sovereign Chamber? Eating?" "Finishing," Marcus said. "I'd had it since morning, long day." Velshareth made a sound that Marcus believed was the Veth equivalent of a laugh, suppressed quickly and with some effort. They agreed to schedule a series of infrastructure orientation sessions for the Velketh duty teams. Marcus would run them. He built the sessions around the principle Carl had taught him. You don't understand a system until you've been inside it. The first session involved everyone present crawling through a service corridor. It was uncomfortable. It was, he thought, useful. 8 months after the incident, the Queen called him in for a formal meeting. The kind with agenda items and staff and a conference table, which was different from the way she'd talked to him before, and he prepared for it accordingly. The agenda concerned the palace infrastructure review he'd been conducting. The 47-page document had produced a series of implementation projects, and those projects had produced further assessments, and those assessments were now ready for review. But at the end of the formal agenda, after the staff had been dismissed and only the two of them remained, she said, "One more thing." He waited. "The Interspecies Infrastructure Council is proposing a new role," she said. "A position that would coordinate human specialist involvement across collective facility projects with particular focus on integrated systems security. The role would involve significant travel and an extended initial posting here for the development phase." She paused. "I have asked whether I would recommend a candidate. I have said yes." He looked at her. "You would still be an HVAC specialist," she said. "That would not change. The role builds on that, not away from it." Marcus thought about Darius, who called on Thursdays and who had said with complete sincerity, "Go do the weird job." He thought about Carl Ostrander, who had believed that the only limit on what you could understand was how far into the system you were willing to go. He thought about a service corridor that was wider now than it used to be, because he had argued about it until someone agreed. "I'll need to talk to my son," he said. "I love a courses. And I have about 7 ongoing projects in the current renovation that need proper handover documentation before I can transition anything." "Oh, naturally." "And the sensor integration in the eastern section still isn't right. I want to fix that before I hand it off, because whoever takes it over is going to have questions, and I'd rather the system be working than be explainable." The Queen looked at him. The expression he had come to recognize, the one that had something to do with receiving something unexpected and finding it more suitable than what was expected, was present again. "Is there anything," she said, "that you do not approach as an infrastructure problem?" He thought about this genuinely. "My son," he said, "I approach my son as a person, not a system. And yet I suspect you pay the same quality of attention." "Yes," he said, "I suppose I do." She nodded. "Talk to your son, finish the Eastern sensors, write the handover documentation." She stood, and Marcus. Well, he looked up. "The wider corridors," she said, "they have been noted in the incident review as a contributing factor to the speed of the response that night. Specifically, the time between your entry into the service network and your return was approximately 9 minutes. The original corridor dimensions would have added 4 to 6 minutes to that route." He absorbed this. "So the argument with the engineer," he said, "saved approximately 4 to 6 minutes," she said, "in a situation where minutes were the relevant unit." He was quiet for a moment. Thought about 3 hours of arguing about corridor width with a palace engineer who had thought he was being fussy. Thought about the fact that he hadn't known why it mattered, only that it did, only that a corridor that was too narrow to work in was a corridor that would fail you when you needed it, and you should build it right the first time. "Carl would have said that's not the point," he said finally. "The point is you build it right because that's the job. And yet the outcome follows from doing the job." "Yeah," he said, "it usually does." He picked up his tablet, opened the document for the Eastern sensor integration, started making notes. The Queen left him to it. Outside, in the corridors of the palace, the Velketh Guard ran their rounds, and the systems that kept the building alive ran in the walls, and in a service junction on the 7th level, a replaced power cell housing sat in an equipment locker with a tag that said evidence in 3 languages, and would eventually be archived in a museum of the incident that the Ascendancy was apparently planning, which Marcus found both flattering and faintly absurd. He had a call with Darius scheduled for Thursday. He had 7 more handover documents to write. He had a sensor integration that wasn't right yet, and he wasn't going to sign off on it until it was. He put the tablet in his tool bag, closed it, and got back to work. "I keep coming back to the detail of the nutrition bar. Half a nutrition bar from the morning, eaten in the middle of a crisis, because it had been a long day and he'd been working since early, and the crisis didn't change the fact that he'd had nothing since breakfast. There's something about that image that I think is the whole story in one small moment. Not the wire, not the service corridor. The nutrition bar eaten calmly in a room where someone less ordinary would have been doing something dramatic." Marcus didn't save the Queen because he was the right kind of person in the right kind of situation. He saved her because he was exactly who he always was, doing exactly what he always did in a situation that happened to need exactly that. He didn't rise to the occasion. He was already there. There are people like Marcus in your life. People who notice what isn't working and fix it without announcement, who are useful in the wrong situation, who cannot be in a room with a problem and simply leave it. I hope you've told them what that means. Thank you for listening. If this story sat with you, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. New stories every week. Subscribe so you're there for the next one. Take care of the people who take care of things.